Okay, so we want to recap what had been said by Fouché. So in Canada there are three main groups of Aboriginal people: First Nation, Metis and Inuit. In general they are 1,400,000 people, and they live on a vast territory of Canada. And for sure there are more than one identity people, so they can share different Aboriginal tribes features. Next slide, please. So from 1980s to 1990s, the residential school system in Canada. And the peak of residential schooling was in 1930 to 1970. There were in general 131 residential schools across the country. Over 150,000 children were involved in this school. And they, as we know, were based on the idea that the culture of Aboriginal people is not good enough. It's not worth of knowing it. It's not worth of living in this culture. And the culture of white men, of people who came to Canada, should be supreme, should be on the top. That was the politic of residential schools. So, in general, the theory that they follow the perspective of colonial thinking. People are coming as oppressors, and a culture which are indigenous culture is a culture which should be eliminated. It's not useful. It was for sure aggressive assimilation policy. They were not allowed to talk their language, they were not allowed to dress like they wanted to dress. Many restrictions, and we'll catch it with Peter. In a policy, you will see how it expanded on a legal base, on a policy level. It was really terrible. And the purpose was to fabricate better citizens who would fit in an image of Canadian people, white Canadian people, holding European culture. We may think, was it ethnocide or genocide? There is still a debate going, and there is one more term, cultural genocide. Yeah, true, but is it about to give in the name for this thing? Maybe it's more about reconciliation. We should think about, I think, not calling it genocide, not blaming again. It should be acknowledged, but yeah, think about it one more again from a perspective of reconciliation. Schools were compulsory, so the children were taken away to these schools. They had no choice. Police was under control of police, so if you don't want, your parents will be sentenced. It was a federal mandate, so everyone should go, and it was on the level of government policy. Please, next slide. So I want to read these quotations from Moran. I'm deliberately using the word slain to describe the experience of Aboriginal people, who were often severely punished and shamed for speaking their indigenous language. Aboriginal people did not lose their indigenous language. It was shamed, beaten, and tortured out of them. All these practices of racialization and racism have had devastating effect on Aboriginal people. The historical legacy of the Indian Act and residential schools continues to impact Aboriginal people's sense of community and belonging. Yeah, indeed, it's terrible, and even generation after generation, it still exists. The legacy of residential schools, it exists. Next slide, please. And it's not only about Canada. The same system was in the United States of America, where they had residential schools. You see the image of a young Indian boy, and later, boarding school, totally different. So culture was abandoned, it was restricted, prohibited. Next slide, please. And one more image from the United States. Aboriginal children wearing the robes, wearing like military clothes. All of them are looking the same. Is it how it should be? Next slide, please. In Australia, it was even worse. In Australia, Aboriginal people were treated like not human beings, like something from a flora or fauna. Yeah. And that this politic was so aggressive, they were not counted like people, And of course, they had the same system of residential schools, trying to prohibit this culture. But as I said before, it was even worse.
And I want to add, Deborah told me that in Australia, they were actually gathering the skulls of the Aboriginals because they thought that they were the missing link between the apes and human beings. So they were stealing the skulls from the graves, and others were being executed just to collect their skulls. So talk about headhunting by the Europeans.
Terrible. You see on this picture, it's Khanin. It's considered the last full-blood speaker of Tasmanian language, Aboriginal people. And take a look on the date. She died in 1876. How many years before died the last Aboriginal person, full-blood Aboriginal person speaking native language in Australia? Because at Tasmania, it's a small island close to Australia. So, only in 2008, Prime Minister of Australia made a formal apology. But as you can see, in Australia it was even worse. So the culture, it's usually, we use the term lost generation. The culture, there is no culture, Aboriginal culture anymore. So.
And I want to add one more thing. Truganini's will was that when she died, that she would be cremated, so that they would not scientifically use her body. But in fact, they did use her body scientifically, and her skull was in the museum in England for a number of years before it was returned.
At this point, I want to give a floor to Peter, and he will go on with policy.
All right, thank you. Again, just the terminology that Carol made clear for us was that first the term Indian was used to describe the native people, and then later First Nations was a term that was used in the 1970s to replace the word. Metis are people that are mixed, but again, from our readings, it showed that if your father was Indian, you weren't Indian. But if your mother was Indian, and if your father was not, you would not be considered a part of the First Nation. Why is that important? Well, because in America, if you're a Cherokee, right, and if you have even 1% or 10% of the blood, you get the privileges of being, a part of the, Native American. But if you don't, in this case, they will not get that sort of benefit for higher education. So I think she did say that this is being challenged, and that this policy will be overturned. Next, please. Okay, now, one of the things that struck me last week when we were watching this video was, well, why aren't parents doing anything, right? Well, why aren't kids speaking out? Well, where are the people that are, fighting for the Indians or the First Nations? All these ideas just came up, and I just felt, frustrated, being helpless. And why were these people in this situation in the first place? Well, there was a reason, because there were policies that were set up by the Canadian government to ensure or to have that sort of an effect 100 years afterwards. And please take a look at some of the dates and the points that were made by the policies. So in 1831, the First Nation people, they wanted to be educated, and the Canadian government wanted to help them. Remember, Canada is huge now, but in the 1830s, it was this one corner of the East Coast, Northeast, mostly, an area of Montreal and Quebec. And so they were working together with the First Nations. They were the fur traders. And in many cases, they looked at each other as equals. We will give you the muskets, you give us the fur, and this was an economical, interdependence. And then in 1844, so-called the Bagley Report, they proposed that the best way to assimilate these First Nation people were to take them away from the parents. And then the Ryerson education policy, by the way, there's a college called Ryerson as well in Canada, recommended that First Nation people focus on religious instruction and agricultural training. So they were already talking about changing their way of life, changing their religion, changing their spirituality, hunting and gathering, to agricultural, to be more stable. And then Gradual Civilization Act allowed the Indians to become subjects to the British Crown. And then in 1876, this was the first Indian Act. which combined all the previous acts together, and they became, the First Nation people became the wardens of the state. And instead of the provinces being charged of the education for these people, it was given over to the Indian Affairs in a federal level. Next, please. And in 1879, in the David Report, instead of farming, they began to propose industrial schools. And if you were to have industrial schools, well, then the kids have to live kind of far from the parents, and the idea of children being removed was brought about, and they all agreed. They thought it was a great idea because the Mohawk school worked. In 1884, Indian Act amendments. There were several amendments, and every time they made an amendment, it was always against the First Nations. Pottery and gatherings were prohibited, and churches were given control instead of the federal government. It wasn't given over to them yet. And fishing and huntings were restricted. If you remember the stories of the buffaloes in America, I mean, they were slaughtered. Buffaloes were slaughtered because that was the way to end the ways of life of the Native Americans in America. In the same way, fishing and hunting were restricted. And then in 1886, there was a pass law. You could not leave the reservation without a pass. So, the question came about, why didn't these parents leave the reservation or wherever they were to see their kids in these residential schools? Well, because you were restricted. You could not leave the reservations. And in 1892, the residential school agreements were made where the government gave a total control of the schools over to the churches, mostly Roman Catholic and Anglican. And of course, we saw the quotes from Duncan Campbell Scott, who became the General Director of Indian Affairs, and his objective, there was no hiding, was for assimilation. And in 1896, 45 residential industrial schools were in operation, and I think things were going pretty well. However, people began to make arguments, the business people. Hey, these Indians are competing with us for industry. We cannot have that. So therefore, spendings on the Indians were criticized and they were cut. Not only that, they were now, the curriculum became went back to agriculture, and for the women, housekeeping. Again, another amendment to the Indian Act was passed where before reservations could be in larger cities and towns. But now, this amendment made it impossible for them to stay together. So the kids were no longer in the mainstream, and if anything happened within the reservation, well, no one was going to find out about it because now the reservations are hundreds of miles away from the cities and towns. 1908, now the reports are coming out. Health conditions were terrible. And mortality rates for some schools ranged from 30 to 60% over a 5-year period. But again, who was going to know about it? And can the parents come and visit them? Well, they needed a pass to get away from the reservation. 1914, there was another amendment. And wearing of Indian customs and exhibition, public, are all prohibited. You needed a permit to wear your traditional garment. So now, from in 1914, this was pretty much the lowest of the low period for the First Nation. And again, in 1920, now the police are involved. The law enforcement are involved. Now they can take the kids away without the permission of the parents. And at the end, of course, today, even the police made apologies. But in 1920, mandatory attendance was implemented. And in 1927, there was a law so that you cannot raise money to sue anybody on behalf of the Indians. So there was no way that these parents could make an argument against the state, against the Indian Bureau, or against the church. Nothing. And they were just completely helpless. In 1940, after the war wars, or during the war wars, and it was interesting that Stas mentioned during the Soviet time, American Indians or Native Americans or First Nations were put in a very positive light. right? So all of a sudden, perhaps because of the political climate of the time, their stances began to change. And also because thousands of First Nations volunteered to fight for Canada, to fight in the World Wars. So they became heroes. And the first Indian Act that was positive was in 1951, because all the previous restrictions were lifted, as well as the legal claims. 1958, school closure for the residential schools were recommended. In 1960, for the first time, First Nations were allowed to vote federally. Okay, so now they recognize that these are human beings. It's amazing. Okay, and in 1969, they take the residential school control away from the churches, back to the federal government. Next, please. Okay. And they give the control over to the crown. In other words, they're saying, all right, the Queen of England, she's going to oversee everything from now on. She's responsible for the previous treaties that were broken in the past, and the rights of the Aboriginals. And so I think this is more of a symbolic gesture. And in 1996, the public inquiry about the damages of the residential schools were called for, and consequently the last Indian residential school closes. And then in the year 2000 and forward, there were agreements, and now the changes are taking place. Settlements are already made, formal apology by the Prime Minister and the parliaments are made, and there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearing the cases across Canada. And in terms of the ethnic genocide or cultural genocide, this term does not exist in the United Nations at this point. So, it's being debated. It's being, people, of course, the First Nation is crying cultural genocide, but the UN does not officially recognize this word. Next, please.
And now we have a chance to watch several videos on the problem of residential schools. Yeah, I think we should start with this one. It's called Death Toll in residential schools.
The stories are heartbreaking